Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead meaningful and ethical lives and use reason and empathy to guide their decisions and actions. We do this because this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge all that humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanities, but also simply for the possibility for peace and well-being when people interact with respect for one another. Our topic today, a non-utopian model for a progressive society. And with that, I'm going to ask Paul and Hank Robb to please sing us the song.
Tom Paxton tune.
Oh, I love that one.
It's a lesson too late for the learning, made of sand, made of sand. In the wing of an eye, my soul is turning. In your hand, in your hand. Are you going away with no word of farewell? Will there be not a trace left behind? Well, I could have loved you better. I didn't mean to be unkind. You know that was the last thing on my mind. You got a reason, a plenty to be going. This I know, this I know. For the weeds have been steadily growing. Please don't go, please don't go. Are you going away with no word of farewell? Will there be not a trace left behind? I could have loved you better. I didn't mean to be unkind. You know that was the last thing on my mind. As I lie in my bed in the morning, without you, without you, every song in my breast lies a mourning. Without you, without you. Are you going away with no word of farewell? Will there be not a trace left behind? Well, I could have loved you better. Didn't mean to be unkind. You know that was the last thing on my mind. You know that was the last thing on my mind.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was lovely and much appreciated. I just always look forward to these first Sunday music Sundays. We all do. Thank you, guys. Well, yes. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jeff Seward, who will be presenting a non-utopian model for a progressive society. This is his final presentation on a series of 6 lectures he's been doing. Jeff holds a Ph.D. from Stanford University, taught over 30 years at Pacific University, and has a very fine singing voice. So let's welcome Jeff to our program today.
I feel like I've set a precedent. I have to sing. And I will.
Oh, good.
To introduce my talk today, I'd like to sing you a single verse of 2 songs from one of my favorite films. These 2 songs give a nice contrast between revolutionary impulses and less than revolutionary reform. The 1963 film, which was originally a stage play by Peter Weiss, is called The Persecution and Assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, as performed by the inmates of the asylum at Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade, better known simply as Marat Sade. It is based on the historical fact that the Marquis de Sade was in fact confined to the asylum at Charenton, and in fact was allowed to put on plays there with the inmates. No scripts of these plays survive, so Weiss's play is his own invention. It is also a musical. I highly recommend it. Very, very strange, but wonderful film. Jean-Paul Marat was a radical, bloodthirsty journalist during the French Revolution who was eventually assassinated by a less radical member of a more reformist-oriented faction. Her name was Charlotte Corday, who was played in the film by a young Glenda Jackson before she became famous. The first song I'm going to sing is sung by the inmates clamoring for immediate and radical social change. Marat, we're poor, and the poor stay poor. Marat, don't make us wait anymore. We want our rights, and we don't care how. We want a revolution now. The second song, sung by Charlotte Corday when she comes to murder Marat by stabbing him in his bath, embraces a less radical path. Once both of us thought the world must go and change as we read in great Rousseau. But change meant one thing to me, I see, or to you, I see, and something quite different to me. The very same words we both have said to give our ideals wings to spread. But my way was true, while for you the highway led over mountains of dead. It's a cheery song. Once upon a time, and for quite a long time, I considered myself a revolutionary socialist and admired people like Marat. I took a wonderful course on the French Revolution at the University of Texas and shocked my professor a little bit by identifying with Robespierre and Saint-Just and the other perpetrators of the Great Terror. As I have grown older, I've been less and less impressed with the unrealizable utopian goals and the almost always authoritarian outcomes of violent revolutions, and more impressed with those relatively rare historical episodes where non-utopian reforms have peacefully and substantially transformed modern societies. And I think there is still a lot of room for non-utopian reform in modern societies, especially in the United States. So what I would like to do today is run through a series of possible non-utopian reforms for the United States. They are non-utopian in the sense that they have already been implemented or seriously considered in other societies, or are things that could be easily put in place by legislation or constitutional amendment without requiring a violent revolution to overthrow our major institutions. I've organized them into various categories. First up are economic reforms. Economic reform number one, let's limit CEO compensation. Let's say that you can only have CEO compensation that is no more than 50 times the salaries of the poorest paid member of your corporation. If you go over 50 times, then you have to pay a corresponding amount into the workers' pension fund or into the federal agency that guarantees pensions when pension funds go bankrupt. There will be an absolute cap of 100 times the poorest paid member of your corporation. If you go over that, all of that goes over that is confiscated and put towards pension funds or the guarantee fund. This would bring us more in line with CEO compensation in Europe and Japan, although even if that seemingly radical proposal were implemented, we would still be much more unequal than Europe is or Japan is when it comes to CEO compensation. Today, the average ratio is not 50 to 1 or 100 to 1, but 350 to 1. Who was it? I just saw somebody, was it the head of Disney? Somebody, his compensation was $82 million last year. Number 2, support and subsidize worker-producer cooperatives to replace stockholder-controlled corporations. Gradually. The Mondragon Cooperative in Spain, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's an amazing example. It's a group of 95 worker member-controlled autonomous cooperatives. They control the main grocery chain in the Basque region of Spain and are also involved in manufacturing, banking, a catering company, schools, including a university, and 14 technical research and development centers. They have subsidiaries in China, Germany, and Mexico, and contract with 132 production centers in 32 different countries. You pay a membership fee of about $17,000 to join, and that becomes your account. And then you're subjected to several months of probation and education into the culture of the cooperatives. Membership fee goes into your personal account, grows by profit sharing at about 7.5% per year, and becomes your retirement fund, typically about $300,000 at the typical retirement age of 62. Workers elect governing councils for each cooperative, and the governing councils then select the managers who can be removed through the same process. And there's a great deal of worker input into major management decisions. Salary differentials between top management and lowest paid worker, which remember are 350 to 1 in the United States, is capped at 6 to 1 in the Mondragon cooperatives. It was originally 3 to 1, but they found they needed to be more flexible in order to attract managerial talent. If your cooperative goes through rough times and has to lay off some of its workers, they are immediately given preference to get jobs at another cooperative in the group. So you never have to worry about unemployment. This cooperative developed mainly in the 1950s in Spain during the Francisco Franco dictatorship, which he approved of because its worker-owned and managed regime was seen as an alternative to left-wing labor unions. But note the non-utopian aspect of this. This developed under Francisco Franco, not as the result of a Spanish Revolution. It's hard to imagine that level of cooperative in the United States, but agricultural cooperatives in Belgium account for 83% of agricultural production there. In Italy, they account for 55% of agricultural production. In France, for more than 50% of banking services. And in Spain, over 20% of healthcare. Here in Oregon, Bi-Mart is a worker-owned cooperative. Tillamook Cheese Factory is a farmers cooperative. And there are still worker-owned lumber mills on the Oregon coast. And of course, credit unions are all nonprofit, member-controlled alternatives to regular banks. If we wanted to, there are lots of public policy mechanisms that could provide incentives and subsidies to encourage the formation of worker-owned enterprises. While we're waiting for those to form, we could do reform number 3, something that Sweden approved once upon a time and almost implemented, but then backed off under pressure from big business in Sweden. Yes, even in Sweden, big business has political clout. This was a wage earner fund. The idea was corporate income taxes would go into wage earner funds that would be used to buy stock in the company. At some point, worker ownership of the company would reach a point where they could place workers on the board, and eventually workers would have majority control of the company, and it would be a worker-owned and managed company. The idea is there would be a slow erosion of the power of the capitalist class, similar to the slow erosion of the power of kings and queens as countries moved toward constitutional monarchy. I like that one. They were about to do it and then they backed off. Fourth reform, a global minimum tax. Again, this is a non-utopian reform. The latest meeting of the G7 countries, the 7 most richest and most powerful countries in the world, came to an agreement tentatively that they want to impose a 15% minimum corporate tax worldwide, so that you can't avoid American taxes by moving to Ireland or someplace that has no taxes on your profits or whatever. There'd be 15% everywhere. I like that. And finally, a financial transactions tax. The usual proposal is a tax of 0.1% on all financial transactions, buying stock, selling stock, that kind of thing. Again, this is not a utopian pie in the sky. Belgium, Finland, France, Ireland, Italy, Poland, Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, and the United Kingdom all have financial transaction taxes. It's estimated that if we did this, I guess this is a global estimate, it would generate $777 billion over 10 years. 0.1% doesn't seem like very much, but there are a hell of a lot of financial transactions going on out there. Some other reforms for dealing with inequalities of wealth. First one would be enforce the goddamn tax laws. It's currently the case that rich people are evading $150 billion a year of taxes that they owe in the United States because the IRS doesn't have the staff sufficient to enforce the tax laws. The Congress recently passed a budget for the IRS that would expand their personnel, and Republicans have been fighting tooth and nail and trying to claw it back as the price for agreeing to other things. The second proposal is from that left-wing radical Milton Friedman, who proposed way back in the early 60s to tax unrealized capital gains as income. Right now, if you buy a stock and it goes up, you don't pay any tax on that money you made until you sell the stock. Then you have a capital gain. He said, no, that's income. You should tax it when it occurs. And so this is a radical proposal of Milton Friedman's that I like. He also advocated a kind of guaranteed annual income, which he called a negative income tax. Third, raise the top rate of taxes on the wealthy. Doesn't have to be 91% like it was back in the 1950s. Let's settle for the rate after the Kennedy tax cuts in the early 60s, when the top rate in the income tax was 70%. It's now 36%, I think. Fourth, raise estate taxes. Lower the exemption, which is now $7 million for an individual, $14 million for a couple. So less than 1% of all estates are taxed now. This didn't used to be like that. Lower the exemption down to $2 million and impose a graduated tax above that, starting at 50% and going up to 90% or more for billionaires like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, as a way to move toward a more even playing field on which each generation can start life. Again, I say this is non-utopian. Seems to me it's embraced by conservatives, at least in principle. Conservatives are fond of saying they are opposed to mandating equal outcomes in life, but instead are in favor of equal opportunity. State taxes are a way to take them seriously about that, so that everybody starts more nearly on an equal playing field. Unions. I like the idea of addressing inequalities, not only by capping the top, but by bringing up the bottom. The most important reform to move in that direction would be to strengthen American labor unions, which are the weakest in the developed world. In 1960, about 35% of the private workforce in the United States was unionized. And the US was much more equal economically then than it is today. Today, less than 10% of the private workforce is unionized. The recent union victories by auto workers, Hollywood actors and screenwriters, and health workers show how significant unions can be in raising the incomes of working people, and not just the union members. One immediate effect of those victories was that non-union auto companies rushed to raise their wages and benefits as well to head off the unionization of their plants, which doesn't seem like it's quite working. A Volkswagen plant in Tennessee, or is it Kentucky, just recently unionized, which was a big breakthrough in terms of unionization in the South. Strong unions don't just improve things for their members, but for others as well. It's hard to see the United States getting back to 35% of the unionization, but most European countries have at least 35% of their workforce unionized, and some have 50% of their workforce unionized. Uruguay, my favorite, under 15 years of progressive government, managed to quadruple union membership in 15 years. So it's not an impossible dream. How can we strengthen labor unions in the United States? Well, first of all, repeal right-to-work laws. Allow contracts that require union membership as a condition of employment, or at least require payment of dues to support union negotiating work. 2, approve card check elections, which reduce the ability of companies to intimidate and manipulate workers' votes. In this, you just turn in a card, and if a majority of people turn in a card saying, I want a union, then it passes. You don't have to have a formal election that creates the opportunities for businesses to intimidate the workers. Third, stiffen laws and regulations against anti-union activities. Fighting unions, preventing unionization, or fighting to destroy unions once they're organized has become big business. There are big, rich firms, law firms, that do nothing but go around and help companies harass workers into preventing their unions or destroying their unions. We should make much of what they do illegal, and better yet, enforce the laws already on the books to punish them for the illegal ways that they're doing that already. Another idea I have is reduce the corporate tax rate for unionized companies to give them an incentive to be more open to unionization. Instead of paying 25%, say you only pay 21% if you permit unionization of your company. And finally, farm workers and domestic workers are largely excluded from rules and regulations to protect their union rights and other benefits. They were excluded from Social Security. They were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act. They should be included and allowed to form unions or national bargaining associations. Again, this is something that Uruguay has done. How about the poor and the middle class, with an emphasis on the welfare of children? Sweden's philosophy is that children shouldn't be deprived of basic features of a decent life, and families with children shouldn't be forced into an inferior standard of living. The economic support of children should be spread through the whole society and not primarily placed on the parents who are already shouldering the responsibilities of child rearing. So what might we do? First of all, do what the Swedes call decommodify subsistence. Basic requirements of a minimally decent life should not depend on the ability to pay market prices for them. So first off, we should exempt subsistence income from taxation. No income tax on basic income, no Social Security or Medicare taxes on the first $15,000 of wages, no sales taxes on food, medicine, basic clothing items, less than $100 an item, and no property taxes on the value of your home that's half of the median price of houses. Second, everybody should get a $50,000 savings bond at birth that they can't cash in until age 21. And then it can only be used for further education, to start a business, or to pay for a down payment on a house. So that everyone can get a basic start on life after finishing school instead of starting off with a huge student debt burden. 3, free community college for everybody. This is already beginning to happen in some states. 4, free university for families with a family income under the median income, which is about $80,000 now. For families with greater income than that, they should be expected to pay 25% of their income over the $80,000. For a family with an income of $800,000 a year, that would amount to a college tuition bill of $180,000. But for a family with an income of $200,000, it would only be $30,000 a year, which would be a bargain for most families making $200,000 today. 5, a guaranteed annual income for families amounting to half the median income. And you can do this in a way where it declines as you get close to that amount. So there's always an incentive to go to work. Universal health care, that's an easy one. Everybody's got it except us. Lots of poor countries have it. Greece has it, Costa Rica has it, Uruguay has it, Spain has it, Portugal has it. Universal health care. 7th, free daycare, either public daycare as an option or subsidizing the wages of daycare workers to reduce the cost of daycare for families, and free preschool for everybody, which is becoming pretty close to universal, but is not yet universal in the country. 8th, free before and after school activities, free breakfasts and after school snacks for all students. This, along with free or subsidized childcare, would make it easier for families, and especially single mothers, to work outside the home and still devote themselves conscientiously to raising their children, instead of getting prosecuted because they left their child locked at home while they went to work. So those are the economic reforms I would suggest. How about political reform? The biggest obstacle to economic reforms of this sort is the radical way that the American political playing field is so heavily tilted in favor of the rich and corporations. How to fix this? Some modest suggestions. First of all, electoral reform. There should be independent, nonpartisan districting commissions. This already exists in some states, to create coherent, non-discriminatory, fair, more competitive districts while recognizing some naturally safe one-party dominant districts. It's not terrible to have some safe districts for members of Congress where it makes sense. You know, you've got an area that's 90% Democratic or 90% Republican. Okay, let them have their guy. Who's the guy that just retired in Portland? Now his name. Blumenauer. He's been in the Congress forever, completely safe seat. And he's been a really interesting, constructive congressman raising issues that other people found it difficult to raise. A national ID card for every eligible voter. You get one when you graduate from high school, you get one when you get a driver's license or your ID card from the DMV. Through whatever mechanism, see to it that everybody who's old enough and qualified to vote gets an ID card that allows them to vote. For each holder of such an ID, which would be everybody, all the adults except people disqualified, an election voucher of $100 would be given to every eligible voter to be used exclusively to support candidates, political parties, and initiative campaigns. There would be a prohibition of all other campaign donations by organizations or individuals. No more dialing for dollars by congressmen spending 20 hours a week calling up wealthy donors to finance their campaigns. So the only campaign financing that would be allowed would be individual voters spending their $100 voucher. Next, free TV and radio advertising for parties and candidates, but exclusively for 2 to 5 minute presentations by the candidates themselves or party leaders for a party without any narrated produced propaganda. And you would qualify to get these free TV or radio spots by having a minimum number of voucher contributions. Once you got 500 or 1,000 or whatever, then you'd be allowed to have your free radio or TV spot in which you could speak directly to the voters. If you want to say negative things about your opponent, you may, but it's got to come out of your mouth, and you have to be accountable for the vicious slanders that you make against your opponents. An interesting anecdote in the paper yesterday in Uruguay, one of the leading candidates for the Progressive Coalition, a few months ago, someone came out with an accusation, someone had made an accusation that was then put forward by the opposition party that he had physically abused a transgender woman some years ago, 12, 15 years ago. Well, yesterday, the member of the opposing party who had brought this charge forward admitted in public that it was completely false, that the woman had made this up, and that there was nothing to it at all, which I thought was refreshing, that someone would actually admit that instead of waiting until after the election to say, oh yeah, by the way, that wasn't true. Next, national and/or state level nonpartisan electoral courts or electoral commissions to administer elections instead of elected partisan secretaries of state. Many countries do this. I mentioned last time I was here, Mexico does this, and it has cleaned up their elections considerably, which used to be thoroughly corrupt. But lots of countries have a system like that. Next, adoption of the German electoral system for state and national legislatures, with half of representatives selected through district elections like we do now, and half through proportional representation, with a 5% threshold to make possible serious third parties, but also provide accountability to district constituencies. A way of trying to get the best of both worlds, of both district elections and proportional representation. Next, political lobbying reform. This is where I earn my self-given identification as a middle-of-the-road extremist. I want to preface this by quoting Adam Smith. I think I mentioned this last time, but I didn't have the quote in front of me. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, said, the interest of businessmen in any particular branch of trade or manufactures is always in some respects different from and even opposite to that of the public. The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order of businessmen, ought always to be listened to with great precaution, and ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined, not only with most scrupulous, but with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have upon many occasions both deceived and oppressed it. In keeping with the left-wing radical Adam Smith, therefore, I mean, we're bringing all the left-wing radicals in, Milton Friedman, Adam Smith, a prohibition of in-person lobbying by for-profit entities or associations of for-profit entities of either legislatures or executive officers or agencies be prohibited from meeting with such officials. Instead, they would be restricted to providing information to legislatures and administrative agencies through public documents and appearing in public hearings before legislative committees or administrative agencies. So their voices wouldn't be silent. They could provide as much information as they can, but they can't do private meetings with legislators or presidents or administrative agencies to deceive or oppress or threaten them or bribe them. Again, I'm into vouchers. In addition to your $100 election voucher, you would also get a $100 lobbying voucher for each eligible voter to be used exclusively for donations to nonprofit public interest groups who would be permitted. They could be right-wing interest groups, left-wing interest groups, I don't care. Donations to nonprofit public interest groups who would be permitted to engage in in-person lobbying of legislatures and administrative agencies, as well as testifying in public hearings and the like. Right now, the overwhelming amount of lobbying done is done by business groups. It didn't used to be this way 50, 60 years ago, but they've really gotten into that. They spend an enormous amount of money. They have a whole army of personnel who do this. They sit in committees and write legislation side by side with committee chairs and so forth. Do away with that. A third area is reforms to address the urban-rural divide, which I think is a serious problem in the country and is one thing that has been fueling the rise of authoritarian nationalist movements like Donald Trump and Christian nationalists and the like. I think we need to reduce as much as possible the differential between the standard of living and the quality of life between urban areas and rural areas. Start with free healthcare for everybody. And one of the problems with rural areas is a lot of them are sort of medical deserts. Aren't any doctors, aren't any clinics and so forth. I would propose creating a public health service, sort of modeled on the British National Health Service, just for service to areas of the country, rural areas, poor areas in urban areas where doctors don't want to go. You'd have a public health care service, salaries paid by the government to serve these areas. And in return for signing up to be such an employment, you do forgiveness of medical school debt and provide other incentives. But every small community in the country should have a doctor and a nurse at least, and a clinic, and nearby, within an hour's drive, other major medical institutions. Broadband access to the internet for everyone all the time. Congress recently passed a bill that greatly expanded internet service for rural areas, but it has to be renewed. And as of today, it has not been renewed. Guess who's opposing it? Probably Republicans. But it should not only be renewed, but expanded. Everybody in the country should have equal access to the internet, which has become an essential tool for education, for business, for even just for entertainment. There should be a national financial support for high school enrichment. There's no reason why somebody in a small town in Eastern Oregon should have access to an education that is in any way inferior to the education available to rich kids in Lake Oswego. They should have access to advanced placement courses, international baccalaureate courses, music, art, et cetera, programs, relevant training in trades. But we need to equalize school funding and school resources so that everybody has access to the same kind of educational opportunity. Again, along the conservative principle of providing equal opportunity for everyone. Free community college within 1 hour of everyone. Everyone should be able to get to a free community college with less than an hour commute. This is not too far from being true now. I mean, one of the great virtues of the American educational system is the network of community colleges that we have. There should be student debt forgiveness to college graduates who are willing to return to their hometowns so that you get a replenishment of young people in small rural towns with education. You should reorient farm subsidies away from big agribusiness corporations and back to small producers and family farms. We're never going to return to the family farms of the 19th century, but we could make viable a much greater proportion of family farms than we have now, and that's a good thing. It's culturally helpful to small towns and communities. We should decentralize government employment so that lots of government employment is in rural areas and privilege local residents for getting the jobs there. One example that comes to mind is they expanded this last time. I think they're going to do it more. The IRS keeps expanding its phone service to help taxpayers with questions they have about filing taxes. There's no reason why you can't have an office full of people doing that phone service in Podunk, Oregon, instead of Portland or Salem or Washington, D.C. or someplace else. And there's lots of other government jobs that could easily be put anywhere, given the internet. And we have telephones and stuff too now, I understand, even in rural areas. But providing government employment in rural areas and providing publicly funded healthcare in rural areas, both, I think, would tend to help change rural people's attitudes about government, which would be helpful. There should be tax and wage subsidies for rural manufacturing and rural employment, incentives for people to locate. There's some of that already, and people are doing things like locating call centers out in the middle of nowhere because it's cheaper to do it. But we should encourage the location of industry. We should really have as our goal, and we ought to be willing to spend a lot of money to do this, how do we equalize the standard of living and the quality of life between major urban areas and rural and small town areas? Another reform I would suggest is reorient the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency towards service instead of punishment. So that you could call up OSHA or EPA and say, I'd like you to come out and inspect my operation here and make suggestions about how I can make it safer or more ecologically sound. And after they do the inspection, if you're willing to have them come give these recommendations, they also provide then funding and technical assistance to help you do it, so that OSHA and EPA become seen like the old farm agents used to be, as assistants to local business instead of the Gestapo. which is how they're perceived today. Ban big box retail in small towns and rural areas. No more Walmart in little towns, so that you can rejuvenate the family grocery store, the family hardware store, etc. Subsidize rural government. The tax base of rural counties and so forth is terrible. In Oregon, there used to be a tax, a revenue that was meant to replace timber revenues for small towns. And it was sustaining local fire departments and police departments and so forth. And that has lapsed and no longer exists. And there's lots of small towns and rural areas in Oregon that are basically bankrupt, don't know what they're going to do. Ron Wyden and others are trying to get this stuff restored, but that ought to be basic, you know. Every small town should be able to have an adequate fire department and police department and other critical local social services. I went too far. Oh, okay. I'd like to conclude by reminding us of the answer to a question. What are the happiest countries in the world? They do these surveys all the time. And the answer is always the same. The happiest countries in the world are the countries of Scandinavia and Holland. Why? Well, one reason is they tend to have pretty homogeneous populations. This is harder for us because we are trying to construct a multiracial, multicultural democracy. And it's sometimes hard for us to see others as one of us. And these countries don't have as much problem in that way. But the other big reason is these countries embrace much greater social and economic equality and life security due to an elaborate social safety net, so that people don't have to worry about eating. They don't have to worry about having a roof over their heads. They don't have to worry about health care. They don't have to worry about their kids' education. They don't have to worry about being impoverished in retirement. Now, people on the right tend to think, well, this is going to make everybody lazy. No one then is going to want to work. Happens that labor force participation in Scandinavia is higher than in the United States, partly because these elaborate social safety nets make it easier for women to work outside the home. And so the labor force participation of women in particular is much higher in Sweden and Denmark and Finland and so forth than elsewhere. I strongly recommend a very interesting book by a woman named Anu Partanen, who is, I think she had American citizenship for a while, but she's a Finn from Finland. And she wrote a book called The Nordic Theory of Everything. And she came and lived in the United States for many years and found herself being stressed out all the time and anxious and not very happy. She went home to Finland and it was so nice. And she was so happy and so led such a more stress less life. At the same time, continued to be a very productive person. So it describes living well in Finland compared to the United States and goes through all the various things that Scandinavian countries do to make life happier. The Nordic Theory of Everything by Anu Partanen, P-A-R-T-A-N-E-N, The Nordic Theory of Everything. I mean, it's mostly about Finland, but also about the rest of Scandinavia. Now, the nice thing about this reform agenda that I've laid out is precisely that it doesn't require a total revolution to work on it. The pieces are largely independent. They don't all have to be done in one fell swoop. By and large, each one can be fought for and won individually, which also makes it a sort of permanent project. Or, of course, if you're fluent in Finnish, you can move to Finland. very strange and difficult language. Worse than Basque, I understand. Or if, like me, you are fluent in Spanish, you can move to Uruguay, which has implemented much of this agenda and is likely to implement more of it if the center-left coalition returns to power in the next election. It looks about 50-50. Before I leave for Montevideo, I'm going to do one more presentation for all of you at the end of July, focused on just why I think Uruguay is so appealing. But of course, first things first, before any of this sort of reform agenda is possible in the United States, we have to prevent the United States from descending into an authoritarian hellscape. Defeating Donald Trump should take precedence over work on any of these reform ideas. Thank you.
Oh, Jeff, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of work to do.
Well, you know, you start thinking how far we are from stuff. There are so many things. Some of it is low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
Others are very challenging. Some of that requires constitutional. Oh, I want to mention one other political reform I was going to suggest. Change the Senate so that every state gets 2 senators, but in addition, every state gets an additional senator for every 4 million population.
Yeah.
So Wyoming would still get its 2 senators, but California would get 10 more.
Right.
So California would have 12. Right now, Wyoming is 1/50th the population of California, has the same number of senators.
Right.
With this proposal, the ratio would just be California would have 6 times as many senators as Wyoming. It should have 50 times,
Right,
but
at
you know,
least we'll take, yeah.
it would preserve to some extent, you know, greater power for small rural states so they aren't completely excluded from national conversations, but not the radically. When we made the revolution, the most populous state was 7 times the size of the least populous state. Today, that ratio is 50-1, but we're still giving every state 2 senators.
Number 1. Go ahead.
Some of your reforms indirectly address this. I'm still curious if you have a comment on the need to reverse the 2010 SCOTUS decision that money is a form of speech in terms of unlimited anonymous campaign donations.
Yeah, you know, doing the reform I just mentioned about the Senate would require a constitutional amendment. By the way, it would greatly fix the Electoral College too. You wouldn't have to change the Electoral College because the Electoral College, each state gets the number of votes that it has senators and representatives. So you would increase the number of electoral votes as well, I think. But the SCOTUS decisions, yeah, those would have to be probably overturned by a constitutional amendment or a radically different Supreme Court. Because the idea that the sort of negative campaigning, wildly salacious propaganda that passes for political speech is what the founders had in mind when they said we should have free speech and free press, I think is ludicrous. We need to move back to where we're having genuine dialogue and discourse in political campaigns and not just competing consultants designing the most effective propaganda.
And not simply democracy being up for sale to the highest bidder.
Up for sale to the highest bidding. I mean, the reforms I suggest would substantially purge the influence, direct influence of money in politics. The rich have plenty of other ways of being heard, you know? They don't have to buy our politicians as well.
Okay, questioner number 2. Raise your hand. Oh,
Okay, 2 quick concerns, both technology related. What impact would the automation of so many jobs impact reform you would have? And also with free internet access for everyone, that would also include scammers. So I think there should be some form of regulation and enforcement behind that.
Yeah, I guess finding and prosecuting scammers is really hard. But when they catch one, you know, there should be public executions. String them by their thumbs in public squares. I mean, it's just outrageous. But the punishments should be very severe for people for scamming. The first part of your question, there was something.
Automation.
Oh, automation. You know, I don't know about automation. People are talking about AI is going to eliminate work. This has been a concern for 100 years. I mean, that's what the Luddites were complaining about way back, and why they were smashing the looms is because they were going to threaten their employment and threaten their skills. You were going to reduce skilled workers to. I remember in the late 60s, there was a big literature about how I used to have several books that I finally got rid of because they're sort of obsolete, but the argument's still there, that automation was going to kill jobs. And so there was a big discussion about it was necessary to have a guaranteed annual income. This is like 1970. Nixon even proposed a form of guaranteed annual income along the lines of Friedman's negative income tax, because people felt like automation is going to eliminate everybody's jobs. And so there's going to be a disconnection between work. We need to disconnect work from income, because there's not going to be enough jobs for people to have. Now, maybe AI is different, but I think probably not. It's going to, you know, it's going to eliminate some people's jobs. It's going to create other jobs. So it'll create hardship for some groups and opportunities for other groups. It's not clear to me that in the end, we won't have enough employment to keep people employed. People will invent other things to do and produce, and services to provide. I mean, that's one thing that's happened. We've eliminated an enormous number of manufacturing jobs. We're manufacturing in this country like 5 times what we manufactured 50 years ago, with 1/4 the workforce. Well, what are all those people doing? Well, they're doing services of one kind or another. So I don't know, it may be different, but having a guaranteed annual income makes it easier to make those transitions. Gives people a cushion so that they can retrain themselves or move from one part of the country to another, or one occupation to another.
And break down
Wait
what's
a minute.
considered
No.
full-time,
No. But thank you, Jeff. Good question, Michael. Questioner number 4. I think we're at number 3.
He's not available right
Okay. Questioner number 4.
Myself,
All right, Leslie.
3 areas I call them elements in the room that weren't, oh, thanks, by the way, for your coverage. And I'd be curious to know your response on it. One is distribution of income to the other world, other than us, and the problem with population in the world, and regarding climate crisis. And capitalism, whether it's our own extreme capitalism or social capitalism or controlled capitalism as the Chinese. And that is the problem with growth, because everything depends on, capitalism depends on growth. And what would be your response to a steady state or possibly even a degrowth type and change of
Well, starting with global redistribution, one thing you could do with a global minimum tax and a global financial transaction tax is to use a big chunk of that money to subsidize development in developing countries, in the way that the European Union has done for poorer countries that became new members of the EU. The EU then had huge transfers of resources to Greece and to Portugal and to Spain and to Eastern European countries as they became members. So you have to, I think you have to get a global stream of public revenue in order to address those problems. As far as steady growth is concerned, I think one of the things that's happening is that we're moving closer to a time when growth in terms of improved standard of living is not incompatible with ecological sanity. I mean, the big problem here is energy. And if we get to a point where we have wind energy and solar energy and maybe nuclear energy, that's a complicated issue, then we can grow without increasing our ecologically damaging forms of energy consumption. And I think that's true in all kinds of ways. There's all sorts of ways that if we change the way we go about constructing our lives, we can improve our lives without increasing pressure on the global environment. I'm not much of an environmental expert, but I'm optimistic that that can be done if we have the will to do it. I mean, we're going to have a worldwide electric car fleet soon, and we're going to be able to do that in ways that are less and less challenging to the environment as well. And that's going to make a huge, huge difference.
It looks like Jules. Jules, would you like to come in and ask a question?
As always, your presentations are comprehensive, well thought out. As a former lecturer in the university, I appreciate your skills in that area. I do want to take one issue with something that came up in the use of the word Gestapo tactics regarding the EPA and Oceana. There's a group called the Environmental Defense Fund. I support them. They spend the bulk of their money in taking these corporations who are anything but cooperative to make them do the right thing. Case in point.
But George, you need to ask a question. There's a lot of people.
The question is, how do we undermine the gas and oil people from using propaganda that says the wind farms out in the ocean are killing whales? And they make that so strong, and every study has shown it's not true. They're not cooperative. So how do we get them to be cooperative? Because their best interests are not in being cooperative. It's contradictory. Yeah.
Well, when I mentioned Gestapo in connection with OSHA and EPA, I didn't mean to imply that that's how I view OSHA and EPA. But it is how small business people in rural states see OSHA and EPA. They see them as completely tyrannical and not in any way whatsoever on their side. And I don't think we need to change the way they operate with respect to big corporations, but I think we need to rethink the way they function with respect to small businesses, so that small businesses see them as allies instead of tyrants. As far as getting corporations to stop pushing out propaganda, I don't think there's any way you can do that. But many of the reforms that I suggest would mean that they would be limited to propaganda and wouldn't be able to buy congressmen and senators and presidents and mayors and town councils and so forth. So eliminating their ability to use their economic power to subvert public officials would make their propaganda a lot less powerful. But other than that, let them pump out their propaganda. We defeated the tobacco companies. I mean, it took decades. I mean, it's come out now that the fossil fuel industry knew about the impact of fossil fuels on global warming in the 1950s.
Yes.
And I think there's some criminal prosecutions that would be appropriate there, as there would be in the tobacco industry as well. You ought not to be able to simply lie to public officials and to the public about critically important things like that with impunity. At the least, the penalty should be that you take away their right to be a corporation if they're found guilty of using their corporate power to deceive and oppress the public, in Adam Smith's classic phrase.
Very good. Thank you, Jules, for a good question. Dave, I think you're next at number 3. Can you go ahead with your question, please?
That was a very interesting and rather long list of possible changes. I'm wondering.
Oh, I cut out 20 others.
You have a summary that, in a written that we could get to. That's my question. Also, let me make one brief comment. That book, The Nordic View of Everything, reminds me of 2 other books. A woman from Denmark wrote a book called The Year of Living Danishly, not dangerously, danishly. And I remember one conclusion that stuck in my mind from that book: you have more freedom in Denmark than you had here because of all those needs for taking care of them.
Dave, how about we just do one? And he's going to answer your question now. I know.
Yeah, The Year of Living Danishly. I like that.
And when they mention another book, The Blue Zones of Africa.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jeff. Thank you.
You know, my wife had good friends that she met in Brazil, a Brazilian woman who married a French guy who was living in Brazil at the time. She actually lived with them for a while. We used to visit them in France, and he was an engineer in the aerospace industry in Toulouse. And she did miscellaneous things, natural healing and various things, and so forth. And it was always very interesting to visit them and get to see their friends and their family and so forth and how they lived. Because in many ways they lived in what looked to be a poorer way. Their house wasn't as nice as our house. Their cars weren't as nice as our cars. But they lived better. You know, they had more leisure time. Their company paid for them to take vacations. They had 6 or 8 weeks of vacation a year because they'd been working there for a long, long time. Paul Krugman has often made this observation that people say, well, you know, Europe isn't as rich as the United States because they're so, you know, backward and they have so much regulation, all this. He says, actually, the level of economic productivity in Europe is almost identical to that in the United States. They have a lower per capita income because they choose to take their productivity in leisure so that they can have a better quality of life instead of working themselves to death to buy more material stuff. And I think if I could wave a magic wand over Americans, the 2 changes I would make is to reduce the American obsession with extreme individuality and reduce the American obsession with the acquisition of material goods instead of the acquisition of a satisfying and happy life.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That was yeah, I have to agree with you. People, you know, working 70, 80 hours a week and proud of it and missing out on their children's life. And yeah, 100% agree. Let's see, do we have a question or 5?
Work, live to work.
Yeah. Ms. Ann, go ahead.
Actually, it's just a short question. You talked about cards for unions. And I wanted to know what, so they give a card to everyone in the union.
They give a card to everybody in a factory, and it says, yes, I want a union.
But it doesn't have your name on it. Is that the thing?
I don't know
That
if it
has
has
a-
I think it may have your name on it, but it's secret to the employer. I don't know. He doesn't. So you turn in these cards to the union, and when a majority of workers in the plant have done that, the union gets recognized. And unions have asked for this for years and years. And the Democrats have often pledged to do it for them, but they never do. Even when they had a clear majority, it sort of went to the back of the legislative burner. But it would make a big difference. And the elimination of right to work laws would make a difference. But, you know, we think of the decline of unions in the United States as simply being a natural phenomenon, but it hasn't happened elsewhere to near the same extent. And Uruguay is pretty unique in that it's had this huge expansion of unions, including unions for rural workers and unions for domestic workers.
Jeff, I wanted to summarize what Susan had written in the chat, and she was giving an example of her own life as a nurse. She was in northern central Idaho, and because she went to an underserved area, a significant part of her tuition was reduced because she was in an underserved area.
Yeah, and I think that has happened. The thing that I would add is you got to have some place to work. And so there should be a clinic. You know, there should be a little clinic in every little town that at least has a general practitioner doctor and a nurse or two that can give primary care and that can be your conduit to regional medical facilities that are better. But hospitals are drying up. You know, one of the consequences of there was this Medicare or Medicaid expansion. Yeah, Medicaid expansion. And most of the Republican states refused to accept the free Medicaid expansion. And one consequence of that was it was devastating to rural hospitals, which depend upon Medicaid funding. And so there are rural hospitals not opening everywhere to help out, but closing everywhere. And medical professionals leaving rural areas. So it's getting worse, not better. So in addition to giving people incentives to go serve in local areas, I would like to create publicly funded clinics everywhere with public employees staffing them. I don't think that's a good model for the healthcare system as a whole. I'm not a big fan of the British National Health Service, but I think it's the right thing for underserved areas, for medical deserts.
Well, in our own state, Legacy hospital system lost $3 million in 2020, either 2022 or 2023. It was, and they had the funds in their savings, but they're closing maternity wards. And they're also now joining with OHSU, which is going to make things even tougher to have a good system. Because Legacy, I worked in there for 30 years, and
well, and in all these states that are outlawing abortion,
yeah,
you're getting a huge exodus out of OBGYN physicians who can't practice without fear of being prosecuted because they provided emergency health care to pregnant women in crisis. And they say, you know, I don't know what I can and can't do. And so I'm going to go practice somewhere where I can be a doctor again. I mean, yeah, what's happening in these southern states is just horrific.
Thank you. Do we have a question, Isaac? What is it? No, we have 5. I'm sorry, I gotta be in order.
We're at 6. I'm 9.
Okay, oh, 5. Are you have an?
6.
Okay, 5?
I think
I
she was.
was-
She was.
Okay, 6.
Do I hear 6 here?
Oh. Hey, Al, go ahead and ask your question, and we've got a bunch of questions, quick questions.
Kurt Vonnegut said that any country bigger than Denmark is a big mistake by some damn fool. And I think when I listen to your list of the happy countries,
They're all small.
they're all small. Is it that the nation state, the superpower nation state is a utopian enterprise and therefore it is naturally going in the wrong direction?
Yeah, Uruguay is a small place too. It's got a population of 3.5 billion. I personally am a fan. I think there are international relations consequences that we might not want to live with, but somewhere I'm a fan of splitting the United States up into about 6 countries and have Cascadia let the South be the South. We should have let them go in the Civil War.
Oh, no.
Let's have the Southwest. Let's have a New England country. Let's have a Midwest. I think that smaller countries are capable of having a much stronger sense of community. And that sense of community leads to a much healthier set of public policies and the like.
Well, you and Marjorie Taylor Greene agree on something.
Yes, yes. Good old Marjorie.
Yes. Questioner 7.
All right, Roy.
Okay, did I get it? They checked that you were, that there's no problem with population growth? I mean,
Oh, I didn't address that.
oh, okay, because I always understood that that was the driving force behind environmental degradation and climate change and so on.
Well, it's only that if that growing population uses more and more energy. If they stop doing that. The solution to population growth, we've tried all kinds of stuff to reduce population growth. All of them have been failures. Even China's one child, well, that was eventually a success. They've now got a declining population, but at draconian cost. The most effective way to reduce the population is to improve the standard of living of countries. As countries get richer, they have fewer kids, strangely. But they don't have kids, they don't need kids as their retirement plan, in part. And they have better access to birth control and various things. The other thing, if you want to reduce population in a lot of developing countries, the population growth has come down enormously. In much of Latin America, for example. The other thing is educate girls. If you give every girl in the developing world a high school education, instead of having 6 kids per woman, they have 1.5 or 2. And you don't have to teach them about population or anything, just educate them so that they can become sort of fuller participants in national life, and they choose to have fewer babies. And so you've got a lot of declining birth rates around the world. In the developed world, the declining birth rate is becoming a problem. You've got countries whose populations are going to decline radically, and that becomes a problem because then you have all these old people and nobody young to pay into Social Security and things.
Jeff, we've got questioner 8. Who's questioner 8? Okay, thank Rob.
When Jeff, my time had come, I hope my time isn't coming to this question. But my sense of the founding of the country under the current Constitution is that it was more important to be a Virginian than an American. And the thing that they were most afraid of was being turned into provinces. Is that itself part of our difficulty, that we are not willing to see ourselves as the province of Oregon?
Yeah, I mean, Robert E. Lee famously, when he was offered command of the Union Army, and he declined, and said that he wasn't willing to take up arms against his country, by which he didn't mean the Confederacy, he meant Virginia, right? And so he had a stronger sense of himself as a Virginian. We sort of fixed that in the Civil War. Said you're not allowed to do that. I don't know that states are the appropriate unit of political order. I'm more inclined to sort of regionality. In Europe as well, I'm a big fan of Scottish independence. And independence for the Basque Country and Catalonia and so forth. It just makes sense to me to have somewhat smaller units, but not tiny units. I agree with Madison in the Federalist Papers, where he advocated larger representative districts, not as large as we now have, but larger ones. Because if you had large ones, then you had multiple factions that would sort of counterbalance each other. If you had too small a unit, it would tend to be dominated by one particular group, some religious group, some corporation. You get the phenomenon like the company town in mining. And so you had to have big enough unit that there would be a multiplicity of interests and perspectives. And I think regions of maybe 20 to 40 million people are a good size. In some ways, places like Uruguay are too small. They get buffeted by outside forces too easily. Although Uruguay exists between Argentina and Brazil. Brazil has over 200 million people. Argentina has 40, 45 million. Uruguay has 3.5, and they've managed to preserve their independence and have a much healthier economy than Brazil or Argentina, and much stronger and more stable political institutions. So it can be done, but I like Uruguay, but I think it would be better if it were 20 million instead of 3.5 million.
Jeff, we're going to do a final question with Isaac, one of your.
Hello.
Hello, it's been 10 years.
I didn't recognize you.
I know, I'm
Now I do.
50 pounds lighter without the beard.
Maybe that is it.
So I want to talk to you about a concept that you actually introduced a few years ago, which is the Overton, specifically in regards to implementation. There's a narrative.
You need to ask a question.
There's a narrative in this country that we're all temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And so when we get to the top, we're going to be able to take advantage of all the things that you just mentioned was bad. So how do we shift that narrative, specifically in the rural areas where it seems to be very prevalent?
Yeah, you know, George McGovern ran for president, proposed essentially confiscatory taxes for estates over $1 million. And he had to give it up because he got tremendous pushback from people like auto workers whose dream was, I'm just working in the auto plant until I get together enough money that I can open up a repair shop of my own or an auto dealership or something and become a businessman and get rich. Lincoln said this about America. He said, we don't have a permanent working class in America. I don't know if it was true, but it was more true then than it is now. People pass through being working class until they become people who own their own land or start their own business. And we shouldn't ever have a permanent, working class. I don't know. I think it's deeply embedded in American culture and in American history that you come to America or you move from one place in America to another to make your fortune. And this idea that that's what your goal in life should be, to make your fortune, I don't know how you eradicate that. Well, Lincoln was opposed to that.
Maybe one of the reasons we shouldn't have let this out.
But, I don't know how you make that cultural shift. Have more Americans marry Europeans. More Americans study abroad so they see other ways of life. Just putting restrictions on people's material consumption just causes rebellion and frustration and resentment. It's one reason, though, that I don't want to be an American anymore. I really find this extreme individualism and this complete emphasis on acquiring material stuff repellent.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes.
Thank you.